Revenge with Marvella. My sister Diane leaned close to me in the hotel hallway, her perfume overwhelming in the confined space, and whispered loud enough for the couple passing by to hear. "You're really wearing that at your age." She rolled her eyes at my uniform like it was a costume I'd pulled from a trunk in the attic, something embarrassing and outdated that should have stayed buried. The couple glanced over, then quickly away, the way people do when they sense family tension. I smoothed the front of my jacket, feeling the weight of the ribbons across my chest, the fabric still crisp despite being older than Diane's youngest child. She shook her head with that particular smile she used when she thought she was being kind while actually being cruel. I didn't answer her. I never did when she got like this, when she decided my choices needed her commentary. I'd almost stayed home that morning, sitting on the edge of my bed at 5 a.m. with the uniform laid out beside me, wondering if Diane was right. I'd been retired for 15 years. She'd said last week over the phone that I'd already had my moment when I mentioned I'd been invited to the ceremony. "Let the younger veterans have their time," she'd said. "You don't need to keep reliving the past." But this wasn't about nostalgia or reliving anything. The invitation hadn't come through the standard Veterans Organization mailing list. It had arrived by courier, in an envelope with Department of Defense watermarks, requesting my presence at a classified ceremony with specific instructions about uniform regulations and security clearance verification. The word "required" had appeared 3 times in the 2-page letter. Tonight wasn't sentiment. It was protocol. They seated me near the back of the ballroom when I arrived, away from the stage where the podium stood draped in flags and official seals. "Accessibility reasons," the young officer with the clipboard explained, gesturing to a chair positioned near the side exit. I understood what that really meant. I was 68 years old, moving slower than I used to, and they'd made assumptions about what I needed. The chair was comfortable enough, cushioned and positioned where I could see the stage if I leaned slightly to the left. Other veterans filled the rows closer to the front, most of them men, most of them younger than me by at least a decade. I settled into my seat and watched the room fill with uniforms and dress clothes, with family members and officials and people whose presence here suggested this ceremony mattered more than the standard Veterans Appreciation Dinner. A colonel standing near the stage entrance frowned when he saw where I'd been placed. Diane had been minimizing my service for years, shaping a narrative that made her more comfortable with her younger sister's accomplishments. She told people I'd been support staff when they asked about my military career, using air quotes around the words like they explained everything. At family gatherings, she'd say women my age weren't in real operations back then, that the military had kept us safely behind desks doing filing and typing while men did the actual work. She said it with authority, like she'd researched military history instead of just making assumptions based on old movies and her own prejudices about what women were capable of in the 1970s and 80s. Our cousins believed her. Our nieces and nephews grew up thinking I'd spent 20 years pushing paperwork. Even our mother, before she passed, had started repeating Diane's version of events. She was wrong on every count, but I'd stopped correcting her a decade ago. The uniform I wore wasn't ceremonial dress, wasn't the standard Class A service uniform that veterans pulled out for parades and Memorial Day events. This was my operational uniform from 1989, the last year I'd worn it on active duty before my reassignment to positions that didn't require public-facing military dress. It carried legacy insignia that hadn't been issued in over 30 years, patches and tabs that marked assignments and qualifications the military had stopped advertising. The shoulder patch was from a unit that technically didn't exist in official records. A joint task force dissolved when the Cold War ended and its missions became too sensitive to acknowledge. The ribbons included 3 that most people wouldn't recognize, commendations given without public ceremonies for work that couldn't be publicly described. A colonel approaching the stage area noticed immediately, his stride hitching mid-step as he processed what he was seeing on my chest. He stopped completely, causing the major walking behind him to nearly collide with his back. The colonel stared at my uniform from across the room, his eyes moving from the shoulder patch to the ribbons to the tabs on my sleeve. Then he pulled out his phone, checked something, checked the date on his watch. His face shifted through several expressions: confusion, recognition, something that looked like concern. He said something to the major, who also looked in my direction, squinting to make out the details from that distance. The colonel nodded slowly, deliberately, the kind of nod that meant pieces were falling into place in his mind, that what he was seeing matched information he'd been given but hadn't quite believed. He pulled out his phone again and made a call, speaking quietly while keeping his eyes on me. The ceremony wasn't scheduled to start for another 20 minutes, but something had clearly changed in his understanding of what tonight was actually about. Diane had found her seat 3 rows from the front, in the section reserved for distinguished guests and family members of honorees. She'd brought her husband and their oldest daughter, making it a family outing. I heard her voice carrying across the ballroom before the ceremony started, explaining to someone nearby. "My sister's here somewhere," she said, gesturing vaguely toward the back. "She probably just wants to feel useful again. You know how it is when people retire. They miss the structure." A few people chuckled politely. Her daughter looked uncomfortable, but didn't contradict her mother. Diane had always needed to be the center of attention, to position herself as the successful one, the important one, the sister who'd built a career in corporate consulting while I'd played soldier. The lights began to dim, the subtle change in illumination that signaled the ceremony was about to begin. Diane settled into her seat, confident and comfortable, ready to be gracious, while watching other people receive recognition. The ceremony began with routine honors, the kind of program I'd attended dozens of times over the years. The commandant of the local military district welcomed everyone, thanked them for their service, introduced various officials in attendance. Safe stories were told about veterans who'd overcome challenges, who'd served their communities, who represented the best of military values. Predictable applause followed each speaker. A young Marine received a medal for valor during a humanitarian mission. An Army reservist was recognized for 25 years of service. Everything followed the printed program exactly, moving through each item with practiced efficiency. Then, just as the next speaker was being introduced, the master of ceremonies paused. He touched his earpiece, listening to something, his expression shifting slightly. He looked toward the back of the room, then at the colonel I'd noticed earlier. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his tone changing in a way that made people pay closer attention. "Additional orders will now be read." That line hadn't been in the printed program. I checked the paper in my lap, confirming what I already knew. The schedule had listed this time slot as closing remarks and benediction. But now the master of ceremonies was stepping aside, making room at the podium for someone else, someone whose arrival caused a ripple of movement among the senior officers present. My pulse spiked, that old familiar response to knowing something significant was about to happen, but not knowing exactly what. My file had been reopened 6 months ago. I'd received official notification that certain classified aspects of my service record were being reviewed for possible declassification, part of a broader Pentagon initiative to acknowledge work that had been kept secret for decades. I'd filled out forms, participated in interviews with military historians, signed updated non-disclosure agreements that carved out specific exceptions for what could now be discussed. But they hadn't told me the review was complete. They hadn't told me tonight would be when the results became public. For decades, I'd written reports that shaped military intelligence policy, but carried no author attribution. I'd built analytical frameworks that were still being used in 3 different agencies, systems for processing information from sources that couldn't be publicly identified. I'd spent 15 years of my career in positions that didn't appear on organizational charts, doing work that earned no public recognition because acknowledging the work would compromise operational security. Other people had been promoted, celebrated, given credit for implementing strategies I'd developed. Men, mostly, who'd been in public-facing roles while I worked in locked rooms with no windows and security protocols that prevented me from telling my own family where I went each day. I hadn't resented it at the time. The work had mattered more than the credit. But watching history forget contributions made by people who couldn't speak about them had worn differently as decades passed. Those frameworks were now under review by people who wanted to understand where they'd come from, who'd built them, whether they should still be used. Diane's posture changed slightly in her seat. She'd noticed something was different, noticed that officers in the front rows were repositioning themselves, turning in their chairs. They weren't facing the stage anymore, where the master of ceremonies stood with a folder I recognized as the standardized classification for recently declassified materials. They were facing different directions, creating a subtle shift in the room's orientation. Some were looking toward the side of the stage. Others were looking toward the back section where I sat. Diane craned her neck, trying to understand what was happening, why the program had deviated, who was important enough to change a military ceremony midstream. Her daughter whispered something to her. Diane shook her head, confusion replacing her earlier confidence. The lights adjusted again, brightening in certain areas, dimming in others. Someone was being highlighted. Someone the room was being directed to acknowledge. Diane still hadn't realized it was me. An officer I didn't recognize stepped to the podium and said something that sent a jolt of recognition through everyone who understood military protocol. Please close the doors. Not a request. A command, delivered in the flat tone that meant security procedures were being implemented. That wasn't ceremonial language. That was operational, the kind of instruction given when classified information was about to be discussed in a semi-public setting and attendance needed to be controlled and verified. The doors at the back of the ballroom swung shut with soft clicks. Security personnel positioned themselves beside each exit. The atmosphere in the room shifted immediately, people sitting straighter, conversations stopping mid-sentence. Phones were being silenced throughout the ballroom, a rustle of movement as people checked pockets and bags. Several attendees looked uncomfortable, uncertain whether they were supposed to be present for whatever was about to happen. Diane's face had gone pale. She understood enough about military procedure to know that closed doors meant something serious. The reader's voice changed when he began speaking again, dropping into a lower register. Formal. Final. The voice of official record being created in real time. The following commendation has been authorized for public recognition following a 35-year classification period. He opened the folder. Captain Eleanor Simmons, United States Army, Military Intelligence, retired. My name sounded strange spoken that way, formal and complete, with my rank restored to what it had been instead of the reduced courtesy title I'd carried for years. Except he mispronounced my last name, putting the emphasis on the wrong syllable the way people always did when reading it cold. A general in the front row stood up. Sir, correction. Simmons, emphasis on the first syllable. The reader paused, nodded, repeated it correctly. Then he continued, and the words that followed made chairs scrape back across the floor as people adjusted their positions to see me better. Updated rank classification, retroactive to date of retirement. The reader's voice carried across the silent ballroom. Major Eleanor Simmons, promoted with commendation for exceptional service in classified operations spanning 1978 through 1994. I'd retired as a captain. I'd spent 15 years believing that was as high as I'd gone, that the promotions I'd been told were pending classification review had been a polite way of saying they'd never happen. Expanded authority designation, granted for technical consultation on ongoing intelligence framework assessment. I was being brought back in some capacity, given access and authority for purposes that apparently needed to be announced publicly despite the closed doors. Retroactive commendations authorized for disclosure. There were more, specifics that I couldn't quite process through the ringing in my ears and the way my heart was pounding. Throughout the room, chairs scraped back as people stood. Not for applause. For procedure. For recognition of rank. For the protocol that governed how military personnel acknowledged seniority. The room stood in a wave that started at the front and rolled backward. Officers first, moving to attention with practiced precision. Then the veterans in attendance, slower but no less deliberate. Then civilians who understood what was happening, following the lead of those around them. The entire ballroom rising to acknowledge rank and service that most of them were learning about for the first time. I remained seated because protocol said the person being honored stayed seated until released from that obligation. But I could see faces turning toward me, hundreds of eyes trying to locate the woman whose name had just been read, trying to reconcile whatever they'd assumed about the elderly woman in the back with what they were now being told was true. Diane stood last, a full 10 seconds after everyone around her had risen. She turned in her seat, craning to see past the people blocking her view. When she finally located me, her face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Confusion. Disbelief. Something that might have been recognition that she'd been wrong about fundamental things. She looked at me like she was seeing a stranger, like the sister she'd known and dismissed and minimized for decades had been replaced by someone else entirely. Or like she was seeing a ghost, the resurrection of a version of me she'd convinced herself had never existed. Her mouth opened slightly, then closed. Her husband said something to her that I couldn't hear from across the room. She shook her head, still staring. Our niece was staring too, her expression easier to read, shock mixed with something like admiration. The reader at the podium was still speaking, listing commendations and operations, using careful language that conveyed significance without revealing details that remained classified. Diane's hand went to her throat, a nervous gesture she'd had since childhood. She finally understood what I'd been trying to tell her for years before I'd given up trying. My role hadn't been honorary. It hadn't been clerical. It had been central to operations she'd never heard of and wouldn't understand if she had. The work women like me had done wasn't allowed to be discussed for decades. The operations we'd supported, the intelligence we'd analyzed, the frameworks we'd built had been classified at levels that meant silence was legally enforced. We couldn't talk about it. Couldn't take credit. Couldn't correct the record when people assumed we'd been secretaries or nurses or anything except what we actually were, intelligence officers, analysts, strategists who'd shaped American military policy during the Cold War and beyond. Some of that work had finally been declassified, the 35-year window closing on operations that no longer needed protection, on methods that had been superseded by newer technology, on contributions that could finally be acknowledged without compromising current security. My service record had been one of thousands reviewed for declassification. But apparently, mine had been flagged for special recognition, for public acknowledgement that would correct decades of forced silence. The reader was explaining that now, carefully, using the passive voice to describe policies that had kept women's contributions invisible. One section of the commendation made several people in the business attire section of the room shift uncomfortably in their seats. Major Simmons's current assignment includes oversight review of legacy intelligence frameworks, with particular attention to corporate partnerships established during her period of active service. My assignment involved reviewing decisions made decades ago about which private companies received classified contracts, which partnerships had been productive and which had been compromised, which frameworks needed updating and which needed to be completely rebuilt, including corporate partnerships with defense contractors that were still operating, that still held government contracts, that had built their reputations on work that women like me had actually designed. Diane's company name appeared in my review files. She'd spent 20 years as a consultant for Stratton Defense Systems, had risen to vice president of strategic operations, took credit for frameworks she hadn't built but had been grandfathered into when the company absorbed older contracts. I wasn't there to take anything from anyone. I wasn't there for revenge or recognition or to settle old scores about who'd been minimized at family dinners. I was there to correct the record, to ensure that frameworks being used to protect current operations were actually sound and not just legacy systems that had survived through bureaucratic momentum. Age gave me something the younger analysts didn't have: institutional memory. I'd been present when those frameworks were built. I knew which decisions had been based on solid intelligence and which had been political compromises. I knew which companies had delivered what they promised and which had taken credit for work done by others. I knew where the vulnerabilities were because I'd identified them 30 years ago and been told they were acceptable risks. Now I was being asked if those risks were still acceptable, if those frameworks should still be trusted, if the people currently managing them understood what they'd inherited. The shift in the room was palpable once people understood what the commendation actually meant. Executives from defense contractors who'd been invited to the ceremony as distinguished guests began whispering to each other, pulling out phones despite the no phones directive, checking whether their companies were on my review list. Lawyers stiffened in their seats, already mentally drafting requests for meetings and clarifications. Several people who'd been relaxed and comfortable now looked like they wanted to leave, but didn't dare move. The general who'd corrected my name pronunciation was smiling slightly, the kind of smile that suggested he knew exactly what kind of disruption this announcement would cause and was enjoying it. Diane had gone completely still, her face frozen in an expression I couldn't quite read from that distance. She tried to stand, to slip out of her row and leave the ballroom before things got worse. But a young officer was already moving toward her section, polite but purposeful. "Ma'am, please remain seated until the ceremony concludes." The officer's voice was quiet but firm, spoken directly to Diane as she half stood with her purse in hand. Not a suggestion. An instruction, delivered with the authority of someone following orders from people senior enough that disobedience wasn't an option. Diane sat down slowly, her face red now, aware that people around her had noticed the interaction, had seen her being told to stay when she wanted to leave. Her husband put a hand on her arm, either comforting or restraining. Their daughter looked mortified, staring straight ahead and refusing to meet anyone's eyes. The officer remained standing at the end of the row, not threatening but present. Meanwhile, the general who'd corrected my name was walking toward my section at the back of the room. People moved aside to let him pass. He stopped beside my chair, came to attention, and waited. No one stopped him. No one stopped me from standing to return his salute, from acknowledging his recognition the way protocol demanded. The look Diane gave me when she finally turned fully around in her seat wasn't what I expected. Not anger at being shown up. Not jealousy about recognition I was receiving. Those emotions I'd seen before, had learned to navigate through decades of sisterly competition and resentment. This was different. This was fear, raw and undisguised. She understood that her career had been built partially on frameworks I'd created, that contracts her company still held were being reviewed by the person who designed them originally, that the oversight authority I'd been granted meant I could recommend changes that would affect millions of dollars in ongoing work. She understood that I knew things about those original contracts that she'd never been told, classified details about what the work had really been for and whether it had been successful. She finally understood what I'd been all along, not support staff or filing clerks or women playing at military service, but the actual architect of systems she'd spent 20 years pretending to understand. The truth was simpler than she'd probably imagined while sitting there calculating how much damage I could do to her career. I hadn't planned revenge. I hadn't spent 15 years of retirement plotting how to expose her or undermine her success or prove that she'd been wrong about me. I'd simply preserved records, maintained documentation, kept careful notes about what had worked and what hadn't during my years of active service. When the Pentagon had asked for people who could review legacy intelligence frameworks, who had the institutional memory to assess whether they should still be trusted, I'd been one of the few people left who'd actually been there when those frameworks were built. I'd volunteered because the work mattered, because I knew things that would be lost if people like me didn't speak up before we were too old to remember clearly. Time had done the rest, creating the circumstances where accurate records and institutional memory became more valuable than corporate narratives and assumptions about what women had been capable of decades ago. The fallout started before the ceremony even ended. Diane's phone buzzed constantly in her purse during the final 20 minutes of the program, messages from people at her company who were watching the ceremony live stream, who'd heard the announcement about my oversight role, who wanted to know what this meant for current contracts and whether she'd known her sister was Major Eleanor Simmons. Her leadership position was under review, according to an email she showed me later. Her access to certain classified materials suspended pending verification that she actually understood the systems she was managing. Meanwhile, my service record was being described as essential to understanding current intelligence architecture in briefing documents being prepared for congressional oversight committees. The family narrative that had sustained Diane's superiority for decades shattered in less than an hour. Our cousins called my cell phone before I even left the ballroom. Our nieces wanted to know why no one had told them their aunt was a decorated intelligence officer. Diane's daughter asked me, quietly, if we could talk sometime about what I'd actually done. She'd rolled her eyes at my uniform in the hotel hallway because she'd convinced herself it was a costume, a prop for playing pretend about a career she'd minimized into irrelevance. But authority doesn't fade with age the way she'd assumed it would. It accumulates, deepening with experience and institutional memory, and the kind of knowledge that can't be replaced by enthusiasm or credentials or confident assertions. The uniform I'd worn wasn't ceremonial. The ribbons weren't decorative. The insignia weren't nostalgia. They were evidence of work that had mattered then, and still mattered now, work that had been classified long enough that people forgot it existed, but not long enough that it stopped being relevant. The room had stood when my orders were read because military protocol demanded recognition of rank and service, but also because the people present understood what those orders meant. Authority that had been invisible for decades had been made visible, and the assumption that quiet women were finished women had been proven catastrophically wrong. Never mistake silence for absence. Never mistake age for irrelevance. Never mistake a woman who doesn't argue about her accomplishments for someone who hasn't accomplished anything worth arguing about.